Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's guest is Kellie-Jay, otherwise known as the Deprogrammer. She is the creator of StopFemaleErasure.com and is a writer, filmmaker, artist, and activist. She's been actively organizing against the gender identity, quote-unquote, industry, coordinating protests in New York City at multiple gender clinics and the United Nations headquarters, and most recently, the final stop of Kellie-Jay Keen's United States Speaker's Corner tour in New York City, which was mobbed by a bevy of trans rights activists and Antifa. In this conversation, we talk about her life as an activist and how she went from a deeply embedded pro-LGBTQ+ educator, or probably better to say proselytizer, in New York schools, and then as she developed as an activist, she watched the trans rights movement take up more and more of the activist space and control more and more of activist culture, until finally she kind of had to break from it because it didn't make sense, and it turned out, from her point of view, to be a project of female erasure. We talk about that, and we talk about her research that she's done since. She's a absolutely wonderful individual, very knowledgeable and energetic, and I have high hopes for her future. However, if you are watching the video, my camera, once again, blinkers out halfway through, so it's just her for the second half. I hope you don't miss my expressive face. Without further ado, here is Kellie-Jay.
It's interesting to be talking to you. It's a little bit surreal.
Really? Me?
Yeah, yes. I know you usually start the conversation in the middle, so I don't know where you're going to catch me beginning.
Yeah.
But I did want to open by thanking you for having me. So I do want to thank you, first of all. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation because it's one that I kind of knew was going to happen for a few years, even though you probably just heard of me very recently, but I've been watching your channel for a couple of years now, so it's a little bit surreal. I started watching your videos when you were reporting on Evergreen College and the kind of like woke implosion that happened there and the whole saga of what happened with Brett Weinstein. And when I was watching it, I knew one day that I was going to reach out to you and that I would want to share some of my experiences. So this is surreal to me. To be doing that now.
Well, I guess it was in the cards. It was a long time coming.
I think it was, yes, on my part anyway.
Why would you know that what I was covering and what you had to bring to the table would converge?
Well, I mean, what you were reporting on at Evergreen, it was basically exactly what I had been a part of. I had been a part of going into colleges, university settings, giving workshops, giving trainings, basically like queering everything up all over the place. So I had been a part of that in a professional setting and also in my personal organizing life and activist work. So it was interesting because watching your reporting from Evergreen College, it was like I was viewing things from a new perspective, right? From an outsider's perspective, looking in versus to what I had been before, an insider or other-sider, right? Looking at it from that perspective. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, so what's your entry point into that form of, is it fair to call it activism, what you were doing?
Yeah, definitely. I would call it activism. I was involved in a lot of different activist stuff over the years. I got involved maybe when I was like 16, around like environmental issues, local issues and stuff like that. And I had been part of forming the first Gay Straight Alliance at my high school. And then after that, I got involved working at an LGBT nonprofit. It was just like a small nonprofit in upstate New York. And this was about 11 years ago. It's a tax-exempt 501c3, and it's all under the umbrella of the New York State Department of Family and Children's Counseling Services. So the funding for the program was coming directly from the AIDS Institute at the New York State Department of Health. And that's kind of how I got involved in being an activist around LGBT issues. And I don't know how much you want me to go into that. I can. I have a lot of different things I can go into. I'm not sure which way we want to head all this.
Yeah, we can just let it develop on its own. So in 2011, then it sounds like, or 20,
yeah, about like
2010.
2012, 2013.
Okay. And so you were a sophomore about that time, or
No, this was
junior?
after. So, no, I had started the first gay straight alliance at my school in high school. Later, a couple years later, as a young adult, is when I started working at a local LGBT center, a small nonprofit. But all of those small nonprofits are connected to the larger nonprofits.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of the story as well. And when I was working there, I really thought that I was doing a good thing, right? I think I had like a poster behind me that said like, be the change you want to see in the world, like that kind of cheesy stuff, right? And I didn't realize that I was really being completely hijacked and my energies were being co-opted to, basically all my skills, energy, motivation, enthusiasm as a young person was all being subverted and channeled to support this like broader agenda that I didn't even know existed at the time, but I thought I was doing something good. Right. But really, I was being paid by New York State to indoctrinate public school children with gender identity and transgender ideology, which at the time back then, like those words were very, like nobody knew what that stuff meant. Not like today where it's everywhere,
Yeah.
shoved down your throats. We were kind of like a vanguard, like the boots on the ground, pushing it into the community. And we use a lot of themes around like just like you see now with acceptance and anti-bullying, the suicide prevention, all of this to kind of gain sympathy and trust of teachers and parents. But I also worked with community organizations as well, not just the local area schools, but that was a big part of it, going into the local area schools.
Did you go straight to college after high school, or did you go straight into the NGO space?
That's interesting because I have a bit of a complicated past. I got into some trouble when I was in high school. I never graduated high school. I took a little bit of an unconventional route. I started taking classes at a local community college while my class was still in high school. So my route was a little bit different. I was kind of a wayward person and but always very interested in learning and education, but more interested in being outside of the institution because I have a lot of critiques of the institution and I experienced a lot of interesting things, I guess, like growing up and being part of the public school system or indoctrination system.
Yeah. So it's interesting because you might have thought that you were being outside of the system, but the NGO thing is part of the system. You're
Yeah,
part of
exactly.
the reinforcing loop.
Exactly. There's a whole loop. And that's the thing, as a young person, you're not really aware of how all of those things operate. And actually, most people are not aware of how these things operate. So, of course, I was swept up into it because you're sold on this whole lie that you're doing something amazing. You're helping to change the world. You're creating opportunities for youth that you didn't have. And that's a really big part of it is exploiting young people, exploiting young adults, and targeting teens who are going to become young adults, right? To get them to join the industry that is ultimately leading them down a path of their own destruction.
So what kind of an activist were you? Like if you put yourself back into your attitude and your emotions, what you were, how you were engaging with this work? Because there's a variety of ways that one can go about doing it. One can be angry, one can be fundamentalist, one can be really friendly, outgoing, outreaching. So how did you fit into that, like attitudinal wise?
It's hard to say because I was involved for so many years. I think my attitude changed and kind of like waned with what was going on around me and what I was witnessing, and also how I felt like how what I was experiencing and how I was being perceived or treated in different spaces. So it's changed a lot over different periods of time, but you know, I would say that I was very trained into groupthink, um, and not realizing it, right? Thinking that I was being subversive, but actually being part of a groupthink mentality. And
Hmm.
um,
What let's just can you describe that groupthink, or what was it based on? Was it kind of like intersectional? Was it everybody has like the privilege hierarchy kind of thing? Was that one of the glues of that? Or what were some of the just fundamental ideological principles that got
yes,
everybody in sync?
yeah, so I think intersectionality was a big thing. And I actually still, intersectionality is something that I don't throw away, though I critique it and I critique how it's being used and weaponized now. I do think that, like, the initial theory of intersectionality, as it was put forth by Kimberly Crenshaw, and like a legal framework to prove that Black women were being discriminated against both on the basis of their sex and their race. There is something to that, and we do need to look at how different axes of identity, real identity, not made up identities, we
Hmm.
do need to look at how real axes of identity function together and how that creates different experiences for different people. Sure, that's a real thing. But the way that it was being weaponized and used to manipulate and control people, I found that something that I was picking up on and realizing that I couldn't say much about it, because when I would critique how different, arguments around like privilege were being weaponized, it would only engender more attacks and accusations. So that was one way that you would learn not to not criticize or critique how these theories were being used or
Do you have an example
implemented.
of something that happened like that, or like an
I mean,
anecdote?
I have all kinds of examples, but one thing that I was thinking of when I think about what I witnessed happening at Evergreen College, I see similar scenarios in my mind that I was a part of, either directly or part of facilitating or supporting. And I remember specifically there was an instance at a university where I was working with some students there. I'm going to not name certain specific things because I don't want to get in trouble for libel. But there was an instance where a man who identified as a woman that I was friends with, he basically had an issue with a young woman, a female foreign exchange student who spoke English as a second language.
Yeah.
And she was very confused about his trans identity. She didn't get it. She didn't understand the language. Even people that spoke English don't get it, right? So it
Yeah.
made sense that she was confused. And she said something like, "So you lost your dick," and trying to understand what he meant by being transgender. And he basically turned this into an entire campaign against this girl and utilized all these departments of the university and lobbied all these complaints, tried to take it to a legal level, tried to get her kicked out of the housing that she was in, all of this stuff. And the way that I was part of it is that I was providing housing for this man before I realized what he had done or what the issue was. All I was told is, "Oh, well, there's this trans woman, and like it's this trans woman of color, and she's being discriminated against in her housing situation, and they're being transphobic, and she's going to be made houseless. She needs a place to stay." So I opened up my home to this person. Then I start to find out the reality of what was going on. And even then, this was back in like I don't know what year this must have been, like 2014, maybe. Even then, it was like I was realizing that I couldn't really say very much because everything was being extrapolated to be transphobic, right?
Yeah.
And I noticed that the young women who were having the biggest issue with this man in the house were all like kind of young women of color who were uncomfortable with what was happening, but wouldn't say anything verbally about it and didn't know how to say anything without being transphobic. So it was like this really weird situation where this guy, he also went on television. He was on the news talking about it. He was on international news talking about his issue, whipping up this huge frenzy claiming, oh, transphobia.
Huh.
And and actually this person is quite prominent in trans rights activism, founded like a major trans online publication, was on like Netflix, was on like a number of different documentaries talking about this issue. So that's kind of one time where I witnessed it firsthand.
Yeah.
And what ended up happening was that and he was also older than the younger women who were concerned about his presence there and the way that he was treating other women. And kind of
older
the
by
entire,
how much? 5 years, 10 years, or
I think by at least 5 years, maybe more than that. The other young women were like new in school, 19, 20, 21 years old. He was like a little bit, I think, closer to 30 at the time. So he had that on him as well, the age difference. But it was interesting watching basically just like everyone fall in line around this person's demands.
Yeah.
And how he was utilizing all of this jargon that was in the school's policies to back him up.
And was there any recourse? Were you able to speak to anybody about this, or was there any like reasonable accommodations or like figuring out like the tensions between different people's rights, or did he kind of
not at all? He just
completely
dominated the entire thing to the point where his boyfriend was sending me emails threatening me not to talk about the situation. And I wasn't even going to say anything, quote unquote, transphobic at the time because I was still part of the trans cult, right? But I was more so just like questioning his motives and, you know, whether it was okay to be making girls feel uncomfortable in their home and, you know, pushing them out of their housing. I was just kind of trying to question those things. And I was immediately accused of racism, and I was accused of transphobia, of course, and I was told not to say anything more about the issue. So that was like one of the times when I was still in the cult where I was kind of like pressing up against these like sort of invisible walls and realizing like, wait, this is kind of messed up.
So
this is really messed up.
If you're a person of color and this other person is a person of color, how do we know which one's the racist? Because we know that white people...
Exactly.
White people can be racist. Nobody else can. But you could. How did you know? Was there a skin tone graph? You know, like
it's interesting. With the risk of saying too much, this person also had albinism. So,
they
actually had no color.
Oh wow! Okay.
They were a person of color with no color. Maybe that's, I don't know what. Not PC to say, but I think it's funny.
Yeah, but how do you deal with who's the racist in this situation?
Well, I don't think that racism should be judged on a personal level. Like, I think that I'm more interested in looking at racism on a structural level. And I think that when it gets extrapolated to this very interpersonal type thing, it's not very useful for very long. And it immediately devolves into it's just a weapon to silence and control people.
Okay.
And that's what was being done in this instance. Okay. And again, all of the people involved were pretty much non-white people, not white people in the whole situation. I mean, there were white people involved, like on the periphery, but the immediate, like who the young women were that were being immediately affected was young women of color, various races. So it was very interesting how this man tried to weaponize race as
and
well.
You said that the principal enemy of him, or this person, gender problems, telling the story. So this trans-identified male or whatever sparks up this whole controversy from an exchange student. So the exchange student is away from her family, away from her country, thousands of miles away from home, very vulnerable in that position. Like you would think that that would give her some cred or some leeway to make mistakes or anything, or it's just weird that he would pick on her. Did she speak fluid English too, or was there even a language barrier?
No, she did have a language barrier as well. So that was leading, adding to the confusion. But again, it doesn't matter whether you speak English or not, because it's all nonsense. It's all made up BS. So of course it doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so you say that now, but at that time you weren't allowed to think that. But you started to see cracks in the narrative in 2014, 2015.
Yeah. Well, also, back then, the standard, like the status quo was not the same, right? It was, I don't think at that time the whole like trans women are women had fully become a thing. There was still this idea, they weren't, the whole agenda to replace biological sex with gender identity and all this nonsense wasn't fully clear to me yet. I was still thinking that, these are just like different ways of playing with gender. And I wasn't understanding what was really underpinning this movement. And also I thought it was more organic than it was. I wasn't realizing the structural power behind it until I started to see like the issue around trans stuff being brought up on TV. And I was like, wait, why is this is on TV now? They're talking about trans rights. Like when I was working at the LGBT center, we were, like I said, like a vanguard pushing this stuff. People didn't know about it yet. It was all very new. And in my mind, I was like, trans are this very small, marginalized group of people. They're never going to gain acceptance in society. Remember, this was before gay marriage was even legalized. Right. I think that happened in 2015. Yeah. So this was before that. And at the time when I was working at the LGBT center, I never even thought that gay people were going to be allowed to get married. I was in this mindset of like, yes, they're so oppressed. They're so marginalized. We have to fight to make sure that people, that violence isn't committed against people who are marginalized. I was thinking about it from a different perspective. Yeah. They've kind of changed and shifted the whole window of what being trans means and what trans was, right? So
were you, when you discovered this gender playground, you're like, okay, I'm going to be they, he, she, the, did you start playing with gender? Did you adopt a non-binary?
I did eventually. So, I'm trying to just think of the best way to like flow into all of this, but I want to back up a little bit, but because before I ever became indoctrinated, I had to be indoctrinated by the work that I did at the LGBT center. It's not like I was indoctrinated outside of it. I was indoctrinated there while I was working there. I didn't know what I was talking about, but I was branded as an expert right away as part of the job. Oh. That's what I was doing. I was an expert. I was going out. I was giving cultural competency trainings to local businesses, organizations. And through that is how I started to learn the whole ideology of trans. Right? Like I was going basically we were given all this propaganda. It would come in from the big nonprofit organizations. We would ingest the propaganda, look at it, do our own trainings, take online trainings, then you're an expert. Then you get to go into the schools with your, rainbow colored propaganda from organizations like GLAAD and GLISTEN, big orgs like that. And we would teach them about the concept of gender identity. And we would use the genderbread person, which I think most people are familiar with by now. And it was this cartoon cookie cutter character. And at the time, and it's gone through several versions. You can look, I think, and see the whole history of the changes to the genderbread person. There's been a lot of them since it was created. And back then we would, it would like teach you to measure yourself and other people by your womanness or manness and a femaleness and a maleness. And even though, we didn't know what that meant as the trainers, no one explained to you, what does that mean? And so you don't even know what you're talking about, but you're tasked with training people. And
wow, it's like Mao's little red book, but it's a little rainbow book. You guys were just like little foot soldiers in this cultural revolution.
Exactly. And that's I'm glad that you brought that up, because I do kind of want to talk about some of the connections that I see. But yeah, maybe I'll get into that later. But in terms of me like experimenting with my own identity, it didn't really come until after I had been working at the LGBT center. I was basically training myself to the language and the ideology and the vocabulary, literal vocabulary, at the same time that I was giving these cultural competency trainings to businesses, schools, whatever, organizations. And through ingesting all that propaganda, then all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm an expert on being an ally to transgender people. And that lasted after I left the organization. And I was involved in like a lot of different activist work, but I was involved particularly with environmental justice organizing. And I was part of a campaign called the Tar Sands Blockade. In Texas, it was around stopping the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline. And that's a whole another story in itself, but that's where I saw gender identity starting to get pushed into leftist organizing spaces, was particularly in environmental organizing.
Okay.
And I left my job at the LGBT Center to go to the Tar Sands Blockade. And when I got there, there were people there, men who were experimenting with their gender, right? And women doing the same thing. And now it was like I was taking all of the indoctrination that I had and applying it in real life, or like trying to anyways, and teaching it to all these people in those spaces as well, being positioned as an expert on being a trans ally. And yeah, eventually
were you aware of how much power you had in that? How much authority that you were granted? Were you aware of that?
It was, I was aware, but I felt like, I don't know, it didn't feel wrong necessarily, because I was like, well, I've done all these trainings and I know all this stuff, and I've been made privy to, this whole world of understanding that other people don't get yet. And I actually saw it as a responsibility. I had a responsibility to share what I had learned with other people so that I could help them to better themselves, so that we could all make a better world.
Yeah.
That kind of type of thing.
When we bring up, I guess, environmentalism and transgender ideology, there's kind of two ways to look at how they're mixing. One is that it's all a bunch of leftism, and it's just kind of homogenizing itself through some sort of process of conformity and leveling the playing field, or erecting a hierarchy within a basic set of assumptions about oppression and identity, and then making, in the case of climate activism, it's called climate justice, gender justice, right? So there's kind of basic assumptions within all that. But at the same time, gender ideology, insofar as it leads to the massive sterilization of an entire generation, works in collusion with saving the planet from human beings. So environmentalism and sterilization of human beings, it has the same kind of outcome in a way. So either something in the ideology of activism itself is pulling these ideas together, or something in the outcome is pulling them together.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think what's happening is that these are real issues, right? Like talking about the environment, like the degradation of the environment, exploitation of the earth, super degrading projects that go on by multinational corporations. Those are real issues, right? But what happens is anybody who cares about them kind of gets sucked up into this funnel and is redirected towards basically a path that is where they can be like ideologically manipulated into supporting these overarching agendas by international governing bodies that they're not even aware of, right? So they take this real issue and they pretend that they're addressing it. They take these issues of corporate greed and environmental destruction and attack of on the land of indigenous people and sacred sites, and they take all of that and they force it into this box of sustainability. Right. And the same way that they take this, the very real issue of the global exploitation of the female sex class, exploitation of female labor, violence against male violence against women and girls. And they take all of that and they turn that into gender equality, which is essentially trans rights.
Why is that essentially trans rights? Or, could you reason that to us? I have some guesses, but I want to hear your reasoning.
Yeah, well, basically because, the language has been changed in law and in policy. In 2019, the UN put forth a resolution that basically retroactively changed all the documentation that the UN ever put forward and switch the term gender to include gender identity. So that was done in 2019. And then in 2021 is when you had Biden's executive order on gender identity, where that was done at a federal level. And that was ordered. It was ordered at the federal level, but it was to take effect all across state, regional, and local level. So it's actually been changed already in the law and in policy. So that's why gender identity means trans rights.
Okay.
I don't know if I should talk about the UN now. If you want, I can get into that. There's so many things, but I think there's a step we need to take, right? From the LGBT nonprofits I was working at and looking at having a back end window into how all of that operated, seeing where the funding was coming from, seeing the collusion with other organizations at the time, not realizing it necessarily as bad. But then later in my organizing work, looking into the co-optation of environmental organizing, seeing all the connections between that, understanding how the government, the private sector, foundations, academia, all of them were working together to co-opt environmental issues into sustainability. Seeing that collusion got my mind prepared to be able to understand the level of collusion that was happening around the LGBT issue. So, a lot of people use the term trans agenda. I've been using it for years, but when I say trans agenda, I actually mean something by that. And it's basically the collusion of, like I said, the private sector, the government on a local, a state, a federal, international level, all these nonprofit organizations, they actually profit quite a bit, foundations, corporations, academia, mass media, all of them kind of colluding together to make legal and social changes under the guise of promoting LGBT and transgender rights. So it is an actual agenda. And these nonprofit organizations, or sorry, these like government and private and corporate interests are using the nonprofits to sort of be like a face of everything. It's just like I was like, the happy propaganda arm of the new coming global economy, that I didn't realize that any of these things were even going on. Right. So they use these nonprofit organizations because people think that they're benevolent. People hear nonprofit and they think, oh, they must be doing something good. They're altruistic. They don't care about profit. They only care about helping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Changing the world for the better, for the good. Yeah. So
exactly.
I want to, there's just a thought that I'm having. Why LGBT rights? Why environmentalism? It could be the case that both of those, race, gender, and environment are places where change can happen, where there's a motivated social consciousness about changing these things. These are points of change. So they're basically, if you can direct that change, you can restructure society, because society, the normal person's already on board with this on a very low level, or inclined to think that that's a good cause. So they'll allow things that are dressed up in this good cause to just reorder society for the better. So these huge corporate interests and government interests know that they can gain a bunch of power right there, because that's where it's moving. That's the progressive edge where the whatever this force is, this global economy or whatever you want to call it, can actually manifest itself.
Yeah, they're using this rights-based framework, right? They've created this idea that there's a group of people, gender people, trans people, that are marginalized and need some type of protection in society. And now, based on that idea, this rights-based framework, they're restructuring the entire cultural narrative, not just in the US and in the West, but around the entire world. Around sex, around sexuality, and around reproduction. And why LGBT? Because they can use this, this whole idea of gender identity is perfect for usurping female sex-based rights, which is very important to the overhaul of the new economy that we are in and moving into more and more every day.
I would assume that it would be the family that's more important to destabilize. Just thinking from one point of view, if you can destabilize the family, then you can destabilize the individual. So part and parcel of that would be destabilizing the difference between man and woman, and then destroying the protections that are already erected around that. But it's principally the individual and the family. And the sex category is just something that, if you can destabilize that, then if you can destabilize what a woman is, you can destabilize motherhood, fatherhood, childhood, and then you have a lot of people who don't have that a strong enough sense of self, which is developed in in a home, in order to not just kind of go along with whatever the government or the central authority wants them to believe in. The state becomes the family. The country, the government becomes the father and the mother, right, in a way. I don't mean to push against you specifically. I was just kind of extrapolating on your idea about how it's not just female rights. It's the whole structure.
Yeah, I think that's another good point. That is also the family unit, right, is under attack. But what's the most basic family unit? The mother and the child. If that's it. A woman has a baby. Men don't have the baby, right? Maybe in the unnatural world that we live in now, men can have babies without women, right? They can adopt or have surrogacy.
Hire a woman, yeah.
Or whatever. But the reality is that the most basic family unit is the woman who just gave birth to a baby, right? Mother and baby. Yeah. First family unit. Not to say that other family units with men don't exist. They absolutely do. And the family unit that we have, that we're accustomed to here, the nuclear family unit, yes, that is under attack, of course, but that's not the same as the specific attack that is being made against women, because the attack isn't just on, us as women, it's about our female biology and our reproductive capacity. That's what the attack is on. That's what needs to be exploited.
Okay.
That's what is being exploited to build the new global economy, and also undermining female reproductive control with all these new technologies that are being implemented under the guise of like the fourth industrial revolution.
Okay, so from your point of view, let's back up to you arriving on some sandy dune, protecting the oil tar that's underneath it, or whatever you're doing.
No,
and you're extrapolating.
A rural East Texas family farm is where I arrived first.
and you were doing the gender thing. Where did you start to question what you were doing, or how did it come to be
part
that?
Of it?
Well, I guess it sounds like you started to have some tensions or questions, and you suppressed them and suppressed them and suppressed them.
Yeah, well, I started to see like I said, the co-optation of environmental organizing by these major nonprofit organizations who were often funded by these same corporations who were engaged in the initial destruction, right? It's like this whole little cycle. After I started to witness that dynamic, I kind of started to get disillusioned with activism in itself, because I did a lot of work exposing and trying to point out some of the collusion and connections and the open door revolving between these corporations, the government, the nonprofits that were supposed to be fighting it, the corporations who are causing it. And realizing that essentially, like, nobody really cared. Like, a lot of activist people, they didn't care. They just kept going as if it didn't matter that we were being utilized towards someone's agenda, towards a corporate agenda. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense, because we're supposed to be anti-corporate and anti-globalization. And like, that's no longer happening here. Now we're actually working for the globalists, and we're working for the corporations. And we're calling ourselves revolutionaries still, and like acting like we're subversive.
Well,
and we're not.
Maybe the corporations were working for you guys. Maybe they're on your side. Maybe they have your best interests and the world's best interests at heart. I mean, it says it like in their logo.
According
their logo's
to them,
got a
yes.
rainbow, and they have like ESG scores and everything,
Yeah, exactly.
So how do we tell the difference between them being good and them using the appearance of being good to not be beneficial? How do we know?
How do we know? Well, we follow the money and we look at the connections, right? We always follow the money and look at the revolving door between these industries, and we see that they're duplicitous in nature, that they say one thing and they're really doing another behind closed doors. I think that's really important, is looking into how these organizations connect. And like, for example, with the nonprofit organizations, like, have you heard of like the Human Rights Campaign?
Yeah.
It's just like a very, very popular one. They have that equal sign logo. Yeah. They're basically like the largest LGBT lobbying group in the United States. And they're a good example for just looking at the collusion between nonprofits and corporations, because they essentially organize corporations to get behind these policies that push gender identity and undermine sex-based rights for women and cause all these issues around safeguarding for children. Like, they put 147 corporations together to write a letter about trans rights. And the whole point of the letter was to essentially say that men need to be in female spaces. And they organize this letter, then they send it to the government. Right. And so you can see how they're working with corporations. How are they? You're a little nonprofit, but actually you have a revenue of like, $50,000+ a year, and you're working with these major corporations. So, are you really a nonprofit? And for example, the Human Rights Campaign, their co-founder was a man named Terry Bean. Terry Bean got all of his money from his former husband, his name was Charles Holmes. he was like the man who pioneered the conversion of pornography from onto tape cassette. So from the theater onto tape cassette for home viewing, and revolutionized the pornography industry, especially the gay male pornography industry. And he promoted barebacking, or, sex without condoms, and made a ton of money on this, had this huge fortune. And he took all of his money, put it into a foundation, left it to Terry Bean. Terry Bean co-founds the Human Rights Campaign. Now, the Human Rights Campaign, they put forth all this propaganda about LGBT, gender identity. And also Terry Bean was working with the US government, right? Like, he was funding money for Barack Obama. He was what was called a bundler. So a bundler basically takes donations from a lot of different sources and puts them together and makes large financial contributions. And he made like huge contributions to Obama's campaign, both of them actually. But he was one of the top fundraisers. And then later, of course, he was given a position in Obama's administration. Right?
What was his position?
I can't remember, but it was something about LGBT, of course. I can't remember the name of it. I think he was on the finance committee for the LGBT issue, like a LGBT, what's the word? Sort of like a what's the hell's the word I'm looking for?
Advocacy or something?
Sure, something like that. So you can see the collusion, right, between the corporations, the pornography industry, the DNC in this case. And then Terry Bean went on to basically be exposed for being involved in sexually predating on a 15-year-old boy. So this is an issue that I tried to speak on that it got almost no attention at all in the media. Like, they really tried to cover this up. But in 2013, this guy, Terry Bean, co-founder of the HRC, he picked up a 15-year-old boy from a gas station in Eugene, Oregon, and he had met the boy off Grindr app. And then he and his boyfriend like sexually assaulted the boy. And then this whole saga went on where for years, basically, and it's still kind of ongoing, he's just completely evaded getting he hasn't faced any consequences for any of this.
Yeah.
And why would someone who's that powerful, face consequences?
Yeah. Okay. So there is, without getting too conspiratorial, we can say that there was this guy named Jeffrey Epstein, and there's this woman named, I never know how to pronounce her first name, but Maxwell. And Epstein got Epstein, so he's out of the picture, but he was in trouble for trafficking, and this other woman, Maxwell, is now she's in prison. She was punished for trafficking underage women to these unnamed sources. We know that those people are in power. We know that in Hollywood, there's a lot of sexual corruption. We know in the government, there's a lot of sexual corruption. Mm-hmm. And we know that there's a lot of power players that are pretty perverted, right? We also know what you're laying out here is that there is a ton of money that comes directly from pornography that is funded directly into the Human Rights Campaign, which is funded into the LGBT movement. So there are steps between pornography, which is explicitly sexual, and LGBTQ rights. Mm-hmm. The LGBTQ rights are now par for the course. They're being taught in schools, right? You were part of the NGOs, but they're also being promoted in all these environmental, social things, right? I remember during 2020, the George Floyd protests, there was this really interesting moment in New York City where instead of honoring Black lives, they're honoring trans Black lives. They had this big rally about trans Black lives, right? So there's this collusion, not to say that trans Black lives don't matter, but there's this co-option trans, for some reason, and even with the rainbow flag, very explicitly, the rainbow flag goes from a symbol of diversity into a symbol of racial and trans rights, like very explicitly intruding into gay rights. So we know that the symbolism's there, the money's there, and it's all kind of going in the same direction. And it's very deeply embedded in the NGO of the deep state and explicitly in the governance through the Biden administration, all the way up to the chief or the secretary of the health department.
Yes, and BLM is just another one of these sort of like co-optation of real grassroots activism, this corporatized government affiliated organization that's just came from out of nowhere overnight. It just kind of appeared and it subsumed all, like I was very involved in local organizing here, building multiracial alliances against police violence, where there were incidents here where there was racially motivated violence from the police in some instances. And I was organizing around that, building multiracial alliances to how do we address these issues? How do we prevent things like this from happening? How do we, community relations, and so I was quite involved in the local network and also connected with networks of people across the country organizing around these issues. And I saw all of that organizing get co-opted when Black Lives Matter came onto the scene. And immediately, and I was still part of the trans cult at that time, but immediately I noticed the pushing of the trans narrative into the BLM narrative. And there was actually issues came up at several meetings I was in with older community members, Black people, who were like really upset about the whole pushing of trans with BLM. And there had been like arguments at several community meetings where like sort of like younger Black people would like yell at the older Black people. And like there was like a whole, so I did witness this very early on. So I don't think it's the case where people say like, oh, BLM was co-opted. No, I think BLM was created to co-opt all of the grassroots organizing that was existing and twist it all up into BLM and create it into something that could be used to reorder the social contract in society. And that's what they did with it
on a massive scale. So what happened? What happened? There's this woman whose name I can't remember, but she's gone through and done. She's a nonprofit. She teaches people how to set up nonprofits, and she was studying the Black Lives Matter nonprofits during 2020. And she goes through all the numbers in the books and shows that the money's not going anywhere. It's just escaping out the back door. And there's all these local organizations. So what you're saying is that you guys had pre-existing networks that were dealing with specific local problems, specific local departments and issues and people. When Black Lives Matter, the brand comes in, it orients all of your work that's on the ground to this invisible entity, sucks all the money into a few millionaires' houses, and then the DNC, basically. It all gets just sucked up. And it actually
ruined all of our grassroots, or it ruined all the work that we had done. It just, all these very fragile, it's not easy to build alliances across race. Yeah. So they're already fragile, and then you implement this new organization / ideology with a very controversial name, which the name in itself is a setup as far as I'm concerned, because as soon as I heard that name, I was like, well, yes, that's true. Black lives do matter, but the name is sort of implicating, it's just setting us up for a problem for other people to say, well, what about my life? My life matters too. Yeah. And that was all what they wanted. They wanted people to say, well, white lives matter. Well, Asian lives matter. And these lives matter. And like, now let's fight. Everybody fight. Let's fight for whose life matters. Yeah. So the first time I even heard the name of the organization, I had like kind of hairs go up on the back of my neck. I was like, I don't like the sound of this. And plus I could just tell it was super corporate and it was connected to the White House. So I'm like, this seems like propaganda and social engineering to me. So I didn't want anything to do with BLM. And I actually never even said like the words Black Lives Matter for like a very long time because I just didn't want to give power to what they were creating, this like weaponized social meme. Yeah, and I saw it's interesting. I remember I brought this up in a conversation with an old friend the other day. I remember this time where everything was kind of shifting in the local organizing politics because all these strange national narratives started like moving in and co-opting real stuff. And I witnessed there was like a protest that was going to be happening downtown, and I went to check it out because I kind of already had a feeling I wasn't going to like it. And of course, I show up, and it's all these people. They're doing a die-in, and they wanted everyone to lay in the street and like pretend to be dead to show, I don't know, somehow that's supposed to teach you, like, I don't know. That's supposed to, I know that there's an idea that they say it's supposed to do, but I can't remember what it is. It's basically supposed to show like the value of life and how it could be you or it could be someone you love or something.
Yeah.
Which I just thought was stupid anyway. I think it's like a little bit belittling of actual violence that happens, like sitting there pretending. And I remember there was this man, a white guy, and he had these like red high heels on, and he could barely walk in them, but he was trying to like swish his hips and like, you know, and he was walking over and he had a bullhorn and he was like leading this Black Lives Matter die-in. And I remember just like looking at the whole scene and just like being like, yeah, no, I'm not fucking doing this. I'm done. And I kind of, at that point, I was like, all right, all of our local organizing is ruined because all of these people have now inserted themselves into it because everyone thinks that they are now an anti-racist ally and they actually have no idea what's going on. Like the sensitive work that we were actually doing, you have no clue what's going on. Now you're going around like demanding things, screaming in people's faces. And again, mostly white people doing this, which was another problem I always had with BLM.
Yeah. So on a number of these different issues, and okay, so yeah, race, gender, and environment. With the environment, like changing the environment, saving the environment, it's this universal concept. You have people working for years where they live, working on environmental policies, working with businesses so that the working class people can have a good life and the environment itself in the community is sustainable or whatever. Then you have like this global outreach thing that kind of strips all that out somehow. Or dens it to this universal, or like, well, there used to be the meme, act local, think global, act local, but now everybody's just thinking globally and not really acting locally. I mean, you get to perform locally, you get to do these die-ins, you get to have the t-shirt, you get to do the yelling and stuff like that, but you don't actually, you know, you're clanging the pots, you're not washing the dishes, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. Yes. I think, you know, it's still what's going on is a thinking globally, but the thinking globally is the elites' globalist plans to restructure and reorder and control society through different methods of surveillance and like behavior modification. That's what's the global part, and we're seeing it being implemented on the federal level, on the state level, on the local level. So, for example, like I was saying earlier, with the United Nations. So, I want to give a little bit of an explanation for the UN and their role in all of this, because they play a huge role that I think more people need to understand. So in 2011 is when they first put forth their first resolution using the term gender identity. And they got this term from something called the Yogyakarta Principles. And that was this set of principles that was created in Yogyakarta, Indonesia in 2006 by a group of like special experts and humanitarians from around the world that convened there. They came up with these principles, and basically it's all it set the underpinning for how to legally restructure everything in the world by inserting gender identity into sex and into definitions of gender and basically dismantling biological sex. So that's the Yogyakarta Principles was in 2006. In 2011, the United Nations adopted the Yogyakarta Principles definition of gender identity. So, and then from there, there's a lot of steps, but 2013, the United Nations started Free and Equal, which was their first campaign around that started promoting rights for trans people specifically. And it's like a global campaign, and they call it, of course, a public information campaign, right? It's a propaganda campaign to start softening people up to the idea of transgenderism. And then in 2015 is when the UN Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals are the same thing as Agenda 2030. They're also the same thing as they get abbreviated to the SDGs or just the goals or global goals. So in 2015, that was adopted. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but I want to jump to 2019, which is when the UN, I had said this before, the UN put forth a resolution that basically retroactively changed all their prior documents that said anything about gender and included gender identity. So right away, they announced this. Well, they didn't really say it very clearly, but it was the announcement that they're starting to take away female sex-based rights on a global scale. So basically any initiative that the UN already had existing that was supposed to be doing something positive for women or girls or females became just sort of like another vehicle for pushing transgenderism and the idea of trans and gender identity.
I've seen for kind of like an example of this on a PR level, there's a United Nations Women, I think, or something like that on Twitter.
They're the worst.
Yeah. And whenever it's International Men's Day, they bitch at men about women. And then whenever it's International Women's Day, they bitch to women about trans women. So it's always about positioning. Whenever we're going to honor somebody, we're going to tear them down for the second class, the ones that are really oppressed. But they attack men on behalf of women, and then they attack women on behalf of men again. So they create this completely destabilizing structure.
They're really good at fanning flames.
Yeah.
They really want people to fight against one another, and they really want young women to fight against ourselves. Really, they want women to fight amongst ourselves. They want there to be like a positioning of the good women who are going along with the agenda, and then of course all of us like bad, evil, villainous TERFs and whatever you want to call us. Yeah, I don't know where we're at with. Go ahead.
I know where I want to go, but we'll just take it by ear like we're doing the whole time. But on your own personal story arc, when do you actually have to start dismantling your worldview? Like, is there a confrontation? Do you get canceled? Do you get struggle sessioned? Or do you do that to yourself?
Yeah, so it's interesting. A little bit of all of those things. A little bit of all of those things. Like I said, I started to run into issues where people, like friends of mine, people I was working with on projects, would try to weaponize identity politics to force me to go along with something or like obey them in some way.
That didn't have to do with actual oppression. It was more about just doing what they say.
Exactly. It was more about just like, give me attention, say that I'm right, validate me, decenter yourself and your own needs, have no feelings, have no thoughts, just be your, the identity that I'm saying that you are. And so I can point at these parts of your identity and say that, they're doing something to me. You're silencing me somehow, or you're not centering me properly. Yeah. There's a lot of examples I could give, but I didn't want to get too personal with stuff, but I know one time a friend of mine said that I had treated her like she was my slave because I was tired after like going on a long kayaking paddle, and I was like laying down on the couch, and she was making some food at my place that, at my she was my guest at. And suddenly there was this accusation that I had been treating her like a slave. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, no, there's literally nothing that could be extrapolated to make it to like prove your argument. And at the time, I knew she was wrong, but I was like, I justified it by being like, oh, well, she's having like, a mental health breakdown because she's very stressed out because of real racism and stuff. So it's like making her like, see me as an enemy right now. And like, I did all this rationalization to try to deal with it instead of realizing like, no, you're wrong, you're being totally messed up, you're now like, you've completely ruined this entire trip, and you now turned it into this like situation where I have to sit here and apologize in all these different ways, and none of them are good enough. I should have realized that, and I did, but I wouldn't admit it to myself. But I knew, I was like, she's weaponizing identity politics to try to put me down right now to make herself feel better for whatever reason and to get her way. And it's ridiculous. So that was one instance. But there were a lot of them. There was a lot of little instances where, people that didn't even know me would try to say, oh, she's anti this, she's anti that, she's, racist in this way or that way, even though like a huge portion of my work was doing real, what I would say is like actual anti-racism, is really like looking at the roots of racism, what underpins it, and how we can what we can do in our interpersonal relationships, and what is separate from interpersonal and is the systemic.
Yeah.
Right. Trying to differentiate between those things.
Yeah. So there's two analysis that I could just like project onto that. Not saying that this is real, but
no,
there could be two levels to this. One, that everybody was already doing that to each other. That was just how the power structure was constantly doing it. And insofar as you didn't play that game, you were more aware of it and you were more vulnerable to it. Because if they could target you in this tearing down way, they knew that you wouldn't do that back to them. And then they could fight over who could tear you down the best. So, because you weren't participating. But that's assuming that you didn't just adopt that way of doing things. And if you didn't, why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah, I definitely pushed back against it as it was coming up in other parts of my life. That was like the first time where it was like really interpersonal and a friend did it to me. And then it started to be like friends, like sort of like associate type people that I would notice engaging in this behavior. And I didn't go along with it. I was like, no, this is actually not helpful, because part of what I would try to tell people, and I still believe this, is that we're all racist. Everybody's racist. Get over it. Like, seriously, get over it. Everybody needs to stop. Of course we're racist. We're raised and enculturated into a society that has all these different like tropes and messages and stereotypes and all these things that have been implanted into our consciousness and our subconscious. Everybody's racist. That's point blank, period. And that doesn't mean that, it shouldn't be this like racist, you are condemned now, like, it's like, no, this is a thing. It's woven into the fabric of the society that we live in. It's something that we have to deal with. You can actively like try to work against that programming, or you can fully accept it and be a racist person, as you're right as well. Like, I think for me, that's part of why it didn't work on me, because I was always saying, well, everybody's racist. So I wasn't impacted in the same way when they're like, you're being racist, you're anti-Black. I'm like, well, no, I'm actually not those things. But of course, I possess some of those, some of that programming. We all do. And can it subconsciously manifest? Sure. Of course it can. But is that what's happening right now? No. You're weaponizing something to get your way, to control, to manipulate, and to silence me.
Why are you so reasonable?
I don't know. I
You
don't
said that
know,
you had
but
a
I
troubled
really,
youth, but there's somebody in your life taught you values, or you have a natural disposition to this.
yeah, thank you. I mean, I did go into all of it in the beginning because I was like, oh, I want to help. I want to do good in the world. So, that was how I got sucked up into the LGBT nonprofit industrial complex to begin with. That's how I got sucked up into a lot of the activism that I realized was controlled. Um, and that's a big part of how I was able to realize that the LGBT world was like the same. It's like you notice the same types of collusion, the same type of manipulation, the same types of like patterns popping up. And you realize like nobody really actually cares about doing what they're saying they're doing. It's all about control, whether if it's on an interpersonal level or, top down control. It's about control.
So,
So
was there a moment where like you were just brokenhearted? Like you put so much energy and time into this thing and you had to recognize that this is an abusive relationship or a failed relationship and you have to move on. Like,
yeah, absolutely. So I was starting to question a lot of stuff, like I said, pushing up against the boundaries of what I could and couldn't say, and realizing really quickly, like, I can't really say shit when it comes to trans anymore. Whereas in the beginning, I was this authority figure. I was now finding myself boxed into a corner where I'm like, I can't speak about my thoughts about this at all without being immediately labeled as a transphobe and a bigot, and like no one wants to listen to that, or no one will listen to a person who is labeled those things. So I was very conscientious about not being labeled those things because I felt like a lot of the other work I was doing was important and I didn't want to be canceled, even though I was later on. But first I noticed a friend of mine contact me saying like, a friend that I had met in Texas contacted me while I was living in New York saying, hey, like friends of yours are attacking me online. They're saying that I'm a Nazi and they're going to beat my ass. And I was like, huh? Like, what is this about? And it had to do with a former male friend of ours who decided that he was a woman and she was saying he wasn't a woman. And my friends in New York were like jumping all over her with all these threats. And I was like, I agree with her. So what are you going to threaten me? I'd like to see you try. Like, immediately when I saw how they were treating my friend in Texas, a white woman, well, so of course it's acceptable to treat her like that because she's white. So, but I saw them treating her like that. And I was like, so is this what I can expect when I say that I agree? And of course it was. So, that kind of happened. This was all happening at the same time that the Trump Clinton election was like manifesting in the background.
yeah.
And that's another thing. I saw a lot of local organizing. I was in New York City at the time. I saw a lot of local organizing be co-opted by fuck Donald Trump. I'm like, no, that's not what we're doing here. Like, stop turning everything into fuck Donald Trump. This is ridiculous. Another co-optation. But anyways, so I was noticing all of this stuff and I was realizing that a lot of my friends who I thought were like anarchists and radicals and like, they were all starting to be like, oh, we need to vote for Hillary Clinton and like, we have to do this and you have to do this. I'm like, but I don't vote. And you guys know that. It's like part of my political beliefs. And you people said you didn't vote either. And now you're organizing to elect this thing, and they were. And so I was seeing all these just like inconsistencies, seeing the trans stuff getting pushed in the media, and then seeing in my personal spaces with my male friends who were trying to identify as women, and I'm looking at them like, no. No, you're not a woman though. Like, you're literally just a gay man. Every other time we've been in spaces together, you're a man. You get treated like a man. I know because I'm standing next to you and I'm a woman and I know what the hell a man is. You're not a woman. And they were like making posts on social media. I started like going through screenshotting stuff I didn't even know who I was going to show it to. I don't even know if I ever showed it to anybody. It was more for like my personal self being like, oh, here's more, like I see this pattern and I don't like it. Like male friends saying like, oh, I'm a woman now, and equating that to like being a slut and a whore and like dressing like a skank, literally. And I'm like, so that's what you think women are then? That's what you think we are. And so I was seeing all this stuff and just becoming more and more annoyed by men trying to just like appropriate womanhood. And then also there was this forcing of the idea that trans women are women. And I'm like, no. Like, I think I may have said it before early on, but I never believed it. And I never when I first heard it, I didn't realize that they literally meant like you literally are a woman, like some freaking Catholic transubstantiation shit. It's like I grew up in the Catholic Church and they tell you this is the body of Christ and you're supposed to accept it's the literal body of Christ. And they tell you this is a trans woman and trans women are women. It's a literal female. No. No, it's not. So all this stuff was happening. And then this might be where you were trying to go with this, but my big sort of like peak trans moment that hit was one day a friend of mine called me and it's kind of a complicated story, so I don't know if I'll go into all the details of it because it's kind of long to explain. But essentially, my friend had been dating a man who identified as a woman, and he would dress just like her, do his hair just like her, his nails just like her. It was really actually really creepy and weird. I didn't like that he did that, but I don't know why I accepted it. I think because I thought my friend was like okay with it and was like happy to do his hair and makeup and nails and stuff. So I don't know, but that's part of what their relationship was like. Strange already. And he was kind of like trying to be like her in all ways. And she was organizing around reproductive justice. He started organizing around reproductive justice. We actually all went to a conference together. It's called the CLIP conference. It takes place, I think, in is it in Vermont, I believe? And yes, in Vermont, and it's funded by Planned Parenthood, and that's a whole other story. But he was there at that conference talking about how horrible, he did a poem of how horrible it was that he can't give birth. And the whole conference was about centering trans people in reproductive health. And reproductive justice issues. And I'm like, well, what the hell do men have to do with abortions? Like, you have nothing to do with this. So that's a little bit of background on him. It turns out that my friend called me one day and she said, and she was saying she, of course, and see, it all gets very complicated because she, my female friend, also identified as a they, them. Mm-hmm. So they were saying she was saying he, that if I can translate it properly, she was saying that he called her and said, oh, I'm help, I've been the victim of a transphobic hate crime.
Oh no.
And then and hung up the phone, or like there was a loud noise and the phone went dead. And so she didn't know what happened. She thought that he'd been attacked or something. She calls me, she's concerned about it. I'm like offering support over the phone. And she is driving at the time. So I start getting online, trying to figure out like what happened. I start looking at a friend of mine at the time was able to access like something about how you get police records or whatever. And we found it popped up on the screen, the guy's picture, and that he had been arrested for, I can't remember the exact charge, but basically he had met up with a 14-year-old boy off the internet, and he had been grooming him, met up with him in person, was at his house, physically engaged in sexually assaulting, raping this boy. When the mother came home, found this grown man on her son, said, like, I'm calling the police, get the F out of here. So he ran out and she called the police. The police came and attacked him, apprehended this violent sex predator. And then and that was the transphobic hate crime that he had
Oh,
called her saying had happened.
okay.
So the transphobic hate crime was him being apprehended for sexually assaulting a child. So as soon as I saw that, I had already been questioning a lot of this stuff, and like it wasn't sitting right with me, and I was reading wrong think stuff already, and then this happened, and I was immediately like, I'm fucking done. I'm done. I'm not calling a man a woman ever again. I'm done. And I told her right away, I was like, we don't have to call him a man or a woman anymore. We do not have to call him a woman. He raped a child with his penis. He's not a woman. And like, she was in agreement with me. She was very upset. She started telling me all this stuff about him and their relationship that I didn't know about prior. And I was like, my God, like, why, how has this been going on? Come to find out, other friends of ours had been telling her, like, oh, you know, all the classic stuff about you need to examine your own internalized transphobia and your own internalized trans misogyny.
Wow.
Yeah. And so there had been all these incidents that already happened between the two of them before this incident of the child abuse came to light. And while I was on the phone with her, kind of consoling her of like, yeah, your boyfriend is a pedo, your girlfriend, your girlfriend is a pedo. I'm consoling her about this. I get another phone call, beeps in on the line. It's her sister, another they, them. It's her sister saying to me, oh my God, did you hear about what happened to the guy? We need to organize right away to get him moved into a women's facility. He's being held with the men. She's being held with the men. It's so dangerous. And I don't even remember what I said, but I hung up, and that was like I think that was the second to last conversation I ever had with that friend who prior to all of this was a very close friend of mine. So I was disgusted right away by the reaction. I'm like, why do you care about that? Why would you want to move a male rapist predator to be with women? Why would you want that, first of all? And also, don't you give a shit that your sister just found out that her partner is a sexual predator and was possibly using their shared home to predate on children? Isn't that like, why don't we care about that? Why don't we care about this woman who has been like, you know, groomed and like being manipulated by this nasty man? So the very next day I get an email from the sister who was trying to move him into a women's prison or women's holding. And the email is like signed by all these LGBT nonprofits in New York City. And it's this whole letter about how a member of our community was targeted in an act of like transphobic discrimination and all this stuff. And we need money right away for legal funds.
Yeah.
And they had, by the time I saw it, I had already raised like $8,000. And this was the very next day. So they were mobilizing quick to get money for this person and get legal support for this person. And and that for me, that experience was just, it broke me. I was done. I was so, it just everything, the whole house of cards came falling down. Everything that I had like all these like little gut feelings and instincts and all these like unanswered questions and things that didn't make sense, like it all just like blasted through my consciousness and was like, hello, like wake up, like what are you doing? What are you doing right now? Why are you supporting this? Why are you supporting male predators pretending to be women? This is so sexist. This is so misogynistic. And like, and I, you know, and suddenly it wasn't even so much as like, oh, I realized all these things. It was like, I already knew them, but I allowed myself to connect it all and to verbalize it and to bring it into my consciousness, which I had been suppressing it and forcing it down for like a couple months at that point. And then it all just kind of burst through, and I was like, I'm done. I was so hurt by it. I was hurt by my friends' reaction. I was hurt by them trying to fundraise for a sex predator. They're sending, for me to receive the email, for other people to receive the email who had been victimized sexually as children, and to have people asking you for money for a pedophile, and they don't even say that that's what they're doing. It's just mind blowing. I couldn't believe that people that I had called friends, people that had been my housemates, that I had lived with, were supporting this. Because the instant that I saw it pop up on the screen and I realized that he had been arrested for sexually violating a minor, I thought, like, that's it. Like, everybody's gonna know now. Everybody's gonna realize, like, everyone's gonna realize that there's a problem with this logic, that, like, actually men aren't women, and actually you're just a man. You're a man, no matter what you want to wear or what you want to call yourself or do your hair or makeup. You're a man. And you have male predilections and you have male genitalia that can be used to do things. Yeah. Period. And I thought that it was going to be a moment of like consciousness raising for my friends, where people will be like, oh, like, we need to reevaluate some of these ideas. We need to do some growing here because we don't have it right. But instead it was like, you're wrong. You shut the F up. You be quiet. We're doing this. And this is what, this is the right way to think about it. And this is the right thing to do. This is the right response. And you be quiet. And that, to me, when that happened, it just totally fucked me up. Like, I don't usually swear on these things, but whatever. It really messed with me because it was like I was seeing everything that I had done, my whole career as an LGBT advocate and ally, and just seeing the whole thing and being like, what is this? Like, I'm being completely used to support something that is basically covering up child abuse. Because that's what my friends were doing. They were covering up child abuse in the name of promoting trans. And it made me sick. Like, I think I didn't leave my apartment for like 2 weeks. I was sickened by it. I mean, just sickened. And not just by that particular instant, but just all the realizations I was having about how incredibly dangerous this ideology was, and how dangerous it was for vulnerable women, not just in America, but around the world, and how you could take this logic and it could be used to take everything from women. And I didn't realize, like, oh, that's actually what they're trying to do. That's the agenda. But then I did start to piece it together pretty quickly after I came to that, shock that day, because it was such a jolt. It was like, it just like jolted me, like slapped me to my senses almost, in a way. I think that had it not happened, I still would have broken away, because I was headed towards breaking away from all of it. I was becoming so disillusioned, so unhappy, so miserable by all of it. But I think if it didn't happen, I don't know that I would have had the really severe, just shock that I think I needed to be able to just have it all line up in my mind, realize how it's all connected, and to have the fortitude to be like, I'm going to expose this shit. Because I knew right away when I started to make these realizations, I was like, I'm exposing this. I'm not going to be quiet about this. I just didn't realize how much resistance and pushback there was going to be. Because also remember, at the time, I was being seen by peers of mine and in spaces as someone who was very sought after, requested to participate in events, to speak at things, to present. I was someone that had a certain level of respect from people and was seen in a certain light. And now all of a sudden it's I just didn't expect so much pushback. I thought there was going to be more. I thought women around me were going to recognize the inherent danger and this logic that was being pushed, and they didn't, I guess.
So there's a meme. I don't think it's particularly accurate for your situation, but it's a left you kind of moment where you're like, okay, we need to change what's happening in our, you're a part of this movement. You've poured your life and your soul and your love into all these people and all this work. You can change things. You think you can come in, we can change things. We need to kind of reform how we are existing and thinking about this one issue. As soon as you bring that up, it sounds like they part and part, they all reject you. Is there anybody who had any signs?
There were. So I did have a few friends who were listening to what I was saying. But ultimately, like, I was completely given the like excommunication. And it didn't take long.
Why did this entire system, this entire framework, all these organizations not countenance you and your criticism?
I think because they were threatened by me. They were threatened by, and still are, by the fact that I was a so-called authority on trans rights, on being a trans ally. And then, I basically came full circle and was like, this is actually really messed up and we need to reject this. And they didn't want to face that. They didn't want to face the criticisms and the critiques. It was so much easier to just be like, well, she's done. She's problematic. She was anti-Black before. She did this. She did that. Like, she's questioning the mainstream agendas. She won't vote for Hillary Clinton, so she's obviously a Trumpster. She's this, she's that. So it was very easy to... it was like I said, it was all kind of coalescing where it wasn't just with the gender stuff. It was with everything. It was with, I was questioning narratives in the mainstream and people were like, you're being a conspiracy theorist. I'm like, am I a conspiracy theorist? Or I'm just like literally pointing to things that are happening and saying that's called collusion. Like that's conspiring. So, I was realizing that there was just a lot of bullshit going on and I didn't have any room to speak on it. And it made no sense to me because I had always been respected as someone who would make unpopular opinions and unpopular critiques and do hot takes on stuff that people were very interested in wanting to hear me criticize different things for. Make critiques all over the place of all different kinds of things. Now suddenly I can't critique anything. Yeah. And suddenly I can't say anything without becoming, being written off, basically.
Yeah. It makes me think that, and I just was speaking about this with Dr. Rollergator and James Lindsay, previous episode of my podcast, about the, when they reject you, it sounds like they're rejecting you because of the fragility of their ideology where they can't handle criticism. So they need to reject you. But what they do, in effect, is lose your contribution. They lose the ability that you have to articulate, to have energy. Like they pushed you out. So their ideology's fragile, but they're weakened once you leave them. And then in that wake of weakness, it seems like they become more brittle, more radical. They have to be a little bit more stern and fundamental, leading up to what happened in New York quite recently, where you were a part of an event. I should let you tell this story, but there was a lot of viral footage of some model harassing you all in that. So you become a couple of different models. So you become a threat to this. You become the enemy. Everybody's an enemy, but you are not even of the right. You don't think like a conservative. You think kind of traditional left, classical leftist activism, equal rights kind of thing, from what I hear. But maybe you've developed since having to reorganize. So the question being, once you dismantle everything, where do you start again? Where do you start over? Like, what are your basic assumptions after losing your worldview?
Well, it's interesting because I don't know that I necessarily lost my worldview. There's a lot that I hung on to, right? There's a lot that I felt like was still very valuable to me. A lot of analyses and theories that I felt are helpful, but what I lost, I wouldn't even really say it was a loss. It was more like what I discovered. Discovering the connections, discovering the collusion, discovering the conspiracy. It actually did fit into a lot of my understandings of how the world operates, of how power functions.
Yeah.
And what I realized was that the people, it was more like the people that I have been in spaces with, their minds had been hijacked and brought someplace else.
Okay. Yeah.
If that makes sense.
But then how do you... where do you go? Do you have to create another network? Is that what you have to do? Because you're not going to stop being who you are, which is a dyed-in-the-wool, blue-blooded activist. You have a message, and you want to change the world for the better. That's not just your identity. That just is who you are, it seems like, from speaking with you now. So who do you take all of your energy to? How do you start to... Do you build? What do you build?
Yeah, well, first of all, I spent some time just being ostracized, and like there was a little bit of like, you asked earlier how that was done, if it was done to me or if it was self-imposed, and it was kind of both of those things. Like I was being ostracized, and at the same time I was like, well, F you. Like you're a fake, you're a fraud, you're a poser. Like, kind of having that type of mindset to it right away. I was like, you guys are full of shit. Like you say you care about this, you say you care about that, but ultimately you don't care about anything. You're promoting the agendas of the elite. You're covering up violence. You're covering up abuse. You're covering up sexual violence against children. For God's sake, like you don't believe in anything you claim you believe in. You're fakes. I still have my moral compass. I've discovered now that there's collusion going on. I'm going to keep on researching that. And that's what I did.
Okay.
I really dove in deep into being like, basically, when I was part of the trans call, there's all this groupthink that goes on and thought termination around like, you don't ingest this type of language, you don't read these books, you don't watch movies like this, you don't read articles or essays from these certain people or people that come from this school of thought. You just reject them categorically because, just a complete intolerance. And that was a mindset. And so when I broke free from all that, I was like, I need to read everything that I can that has been opposing trans ideology, because I got all the indoctrination about why it's so great and wonderful and having that shoved down my throat for years. Now I need to dive into all the other sides of this and get a more holistic understanding and perspective. Once I started doing that, I was like, well, obviously, this makes so much sense that they have co-opted. They're co-opting like LGBT, they're co-opting feminism, they're co-opting race stuff. Like everything is being co-opted, and it's because it's all being used to push these overarching global agendas. Again, like the Sustainable Development Goals.
So where do you begin on researching this, or what are some of the pillars of your research?
Well, a lot of it, I mean, I've had to dive in quite a bit to the UN stuff. Like, I started looking into it on my own before I realized that some other women had done a little bit of research into it. Like I know Jennifer Billick mentioned some of the stuff about the UN in at least one of her articles. She doesn't go into it, but she mentions their involvement. I know that there was like Beth Stelzer from Save Women's Sports. She put out like a statement talking about the UN's like changing of the term gender identity and how that was affecting women and girls sports. I know like Partners for Ethical Care, Jeanette and Jennifer, they've both been on your show. They also put out a statement talking about a little bit naming the UN for their role, but all of it was very like kind of surface level and just directing me to the idea that they had something to do with it. Then I just kind of jumped into the whole thing on my own, basically looking through all of their propaganda first and seeing what was available on YouTube, looking at the propaganda, deciphering the messages in it, realizing like, wow, they're really not joking around with how much money they're putting into this. And then from that, looking into like, all right, what are the actual, what are the policies? What are the resolutions? What are they actually pushing? And come to find out, I mean, people say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist because you're saying that, you know, these international governing bodies are colluding with the corporations and the private sector, and they're all against us. And I'm like, well, there's literally thousands of documents online where they say so themselves that they're doing this.
Yeah.
It's not a secret. It's that there's a duplicitous nature of the language, which hides the true nature of what they're really pushing. Right. So if once you know the code and what their keywords are, once you understand that this means this, that when they say women and girls, it includes the definition of biological men and boys. Once you realize that, then you read through everything with completely new eyes. And it makes sense to you what they're actually trying to do, which is completely destabilize and eliminate the sex-based rights of women and girls all around the world.
You did all this work on training people, on conscious raising or awareness raising.
Cultural sensitivity.
They even use the same, it's like just so Maoist, you know, cultural revolution, cultural sensitivity.
Yes.
It's all the same kind of thing. But how do you reverse engineer that to do good? You have all these skills, or do you have to find new skills in order to promote different information? Like beginning again and fighting this behemoth, this ideological behemoth, how do you educate people? What has been your tactics and your successes in doing that?
Reverse propaganda. You know, like I look and I see all the propaganda that we're being force fed, and I realize we have to counter those messages and counter the narratives that are being created. So that's part of what I've been trying to do is expose and document as much as I can that this is a collusion, that this is not by accident. This is no organic little movement. This is very much by design, exposing all the connections to prove that it's by design, showing the overarching patterns to show, you know, we keep having these, we keep having the same narratives show up across all these different issues, the same talking points used, the same rhetoric, the same words, even just like get with the cultural sensitivity, cultural revolution. It's like the same terminology. And so trying to expose that, showing that this is connected to the exploitation of female reproductive technology is very important to me as well. Connecting this process of what's happening, the attack on our female biological sex, to colonization itself is very important to me. And I believe part of you know, focusing on that can help to kind of break through to people on the quote other side who are still caught up in the trans issue, not realizing they're shooting themselves in their own feet with the other organizing work that they're doing, right? If that makes sense. Because this issue, this trans issue has like mucked up all grassroots organizing work across it doesn't matter what your issue is, it's now been muddied up by trans activism, every single issue you can imagine. And that goes into with the sustainable development goals, what they're really doing is, so it's 17 global goals put forth by the United Nations. It's 193 member nation states that are all behind these goals. The goals are supposed to transform and reshape society. It's this massive project of their own accord. It's like the biggest undertaking ever to restructure society, not just in the West, but the entire world. And gender equality, which is goal number 5, it cuts across all 17 goals. So gender equality basically means gender identity, which means trans rights. Trans rights cuts across every single one of the 17 global goals. So it's fundamental. Pushing trans rights, which is all about pushing the exploitation and commodification of female biology, is what's underpinning the entire push for the Sustainable Development Goals.
Why? In your mind, why? Why is that such a linchpin?
Because so the UN and the World Economic Forum, they're pushing this concept that we're moving in, and it's not just them, but it's largely coming from them and the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab, this idea that we're moving into the fourth industrial revolution, which is the merging of human biology with technology and artificial intelligence. So this is where you can see that this is all about attacking female reproduction, because what they want to do is usurp and control the ability to for reproduction on the planet. And Klaus Schwab is basically the architect of the fourth industrial revolution, even though this terminology it's being implemented and picked up across all different sectors. It's being pushed in academia. It's not a fringe thing at all. This is like, we had 1, 2, 3, and now we're on to the fourth. And, he basically says that it's going to revolutionize our human biology and change fundamentally what it means to be human. So changing what it means to be human is connected to changing or taking control of reproduction. And that's what they're pushing. They're pushing all of these technologies to essentially replace women and the function that women's bodies have been producing children since time immemorial, and now they want to usurp that control and that production and put it into the hands of men and machines. So that's what's being done right now. And these connections, some would say, oh, she's extrapolating, but I mean, it's connect. I can show you exactly where, this guy and this guy, they say that, like, it's very clear. There's documentation for all of this. It's more, what I'm doing really is just sifting through all of it and putting my own understanding onto it and trying to explain it to others. And I'm sure there are other things, right, that other people can add to this conversation that I can learn from as well. But I'm just trying to say, what do I notice here? What are the connections that I see, and visibilize that for other people. And this whole idea that's being pushed is that, we're going to own nothing and be happy with it. So when they talk about owning nothing, they mean that you won't own anything, including your ownership of your own body. And if you're a woman, your female reproductive technology will not belong to you any longer. They're communizing our bodies, basically. They're communizing women's reproduction.
And ergo children. If children don't have mothers, then they're wards of the state.
Perfect. That's exactly what we need to push this new global order. And youth are very important to this, mind you, because the UN is very, very focused on children and youth. They talk a lot about how youth are critical agents of change and that they can be used to not just implement these changes across society, but to demand their implementation. Yeah. It's very forceful language that gets used. And I think to me, it's really creepy because I see a lot of connections with the way that they are basically the way that they're shaping young people to be these agents of change, these activists, right? These weaponized activists for the elites. It's very similar to, I think, did you mention the Red Guards in the middle or in the beginning of this conversation? It's very similar. There's a lot of crossover between what we see happening now on a global scale and what happened in China during Mao's communist revolution. Like during the communist revolution, they had the Red Guards, and the Red Guards were sort of like what I would say are the like modern trans rights activists, are comparable to them. The way that
Antifa, maybe even.
And Antifa, right, or people that call themselves Antifa, that call themselves TRA, sort of like what we saw in New York, what we were faced with during the Let Women Speak protests there, all the violence and everything, I see those people sort of like the Red Guard, right? Because they're basically using violence and force to destroy the cultural norms and like the social contract, to completely cut it down and reorder it. And the Red Guards in China, they did this thing called the destruction of the four olds. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's basically just the old ways. And I can't remember all four of them, but it's just like the old ways of thinking, old ways of being, old religion, old, like, just anything that was the old way was being destroyed systematically by these Red Guards. And they were like, literally, it's interesting because this whole issue with trans, it's like these trans rights activists are inverting reality, right? By telling us up is down, that man is woman, that, you know, sky is green and grass is blue. And the Red Guards, they actually forced people to take the traffic lights and say that red meant go and green meant stop. So this was the type of literal inversion that they were forcing onto society. And they were going around committing acts of violence against people that resisted them, including professors and teachers, which when I was watching your Evergreen expose and I saw what happened to Brett and how he was getting surrounded in the hallway and stuff, I was instantly like, oh my God, the Red Guard. They're the Red Guard. They're the new Red Guard.
Well, and you know what happened to the Red Guard once Mao was done with them? He sent them out into the paddy fields, and they all starved. They were kicked out of society, and that's kind of what's happening with the reproductive power of the people who sign up for this stuff.
Absolutely. They don't care about those people at all. They're just fodder for the cannon.
Yeah.
And even, you know, they had the Red Guards, and then they had the Little Red Guards, which was aimed at school children. You know, and it was propaganda for students that were like, you know, elementary and high school school students. It was like a totally new curriculum that was sanctioned by the Communist Party. And you can see now in education, there's new curriculums coming in, right? There's Common Core, there's the LGBT stuff, comprehensive sex education, SOGI, diversity and inclusion, equity, anti-racism. This is all the new school curriculum that's organized and sanctioned by the people in power, right? And like these kids, these little Red Guards, if they didn't meet like certain political criteria, they were excluded from being part of the like in group, right? And that's exactly what you see happening right now. Yeah. Young people, even children who don't agree or who resist or who challenge it, are made to be, you know, ostracized and pointed at like, oh, you're on the outs. And when you're on the inside, you get rewarded, right? You get rewarded with things, even if it's just like likes and shares and reposts on the internet or whatever, that's still a reward. Yeah. Right.
Well, it's also grades, you know, and then credentials eventually. Yeah. I mean, it's working through colleges. There's more and more of colleges. You have to jump through all this believing hoops in order to get your degree. And they're even making the degree less valuable because they have to make sure that there's equal outcomes on the other end. So the teachers are becoming more and more ideological while the value of the education is becoming less and less valuable.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, when I was at the LGBT center, there were no trans kids in society. That was not a term or a concept that anyone knew about, myself included. Even though I had met like teens that identified as trans and young people, like there was just no such thing as a trans kid. And I think it was like 7 years ago. Yeah, like a little bit before the Trump election, when I first heard about trans kids, and I saw like a propaganda piece about it. And it was like this Black family in Brooklyn, and the mom was like introducing the daughter as a son, saying that, and she literally says in the propaganda piece I saw that this 2-year-old child wanted a doctor to create a peanut for her. For him, she was calling her daughter a boy. Yeah. And I'm like, what 2-year-old says they want a doctor to create a piece of genitalia for them. What that clearly is not coming from a child. That's clearly this is a propagandist talking point being forced on us. So this idea of the trans child, I was immediately like disturbed when I saw it. I was not like, oh yeah, trans kids. Right away I was like, wait a second, like this isn't supposed to be for children, even though when I was working at the LGBT center, I was working with technical children. You know, they were like 13, 14, but those are children. So in my mind, I hadn't even really connected yet that I had already been exploiting and indoctrinating and grooming children until I saw this invention of the trans kid, and the kids were so young. And then I was like, whoa, this is totally wrong. And then I started to realize, like, wait, it's also wrong to be pushing this on teenagers as well. Like why is this being pushed on young people so hard? Clearly it's pedophilic in nature. Prior to this whole like agenda being pushed on TV, you never heard conversations on TV between adults and children talking about genitalia and sexual like body part, like sexed body parts or sexual orientation or anything. You never heard that prior to this. I remember the first like thing I had heard on TV where they were talking to a trans kid, and I was just like, this is disturbing. Why would you talk about a child with this? And the reality is, if a child says, mommy, I'm a boy, and the child is a girl, your response should be, actually, no, you're a girl. Your cousin so-and-so is a boy. Daddy's a boy. Like, whatever is a boy. You're a girl. Like, mommy's a girl. Like, just explain to them the basics of reality. You don't say, oh, a child said that they're a dinosaur, so now I believe that and I'm going with that because they said so. And at 2 years old, they know a lot about their inner, dinosaur identity. It makes no sense when you apply it to literally anything else. It makes no sense.
Yeah. Well, someday we'll have velociraptor genders if Klaus Schwab gets his way. I mean, that's the only way he's going to get us to eat bugs all day, turn us into a bunch of chickens, right?
And this whole thing with trans, it's just a stop along the way towards transhumanism. It's, this pushing of trans, like you were saying earlier, they don't care about the red guards. They went off and starved in a paddy field afterwards. Just like these trans rights activists, they don't give a crap about them. You're used up and you're spent and you're done. And we're on to the next groomed victim because we have an endless supply of groomed victims because we're grooming people systematically through the public school system. So we don't need you anymore. There's an endless fresh batch of people that can be exploited and manipulated, and their well-meaning desires can be, subverted towards our ends. And all of this is just a pit stop towards transhumanism, which is where they're taking this, which is all about what the fourth industrial revolution is about, merging human biology with machine and artificial intelligence. That's transhumanism. So, it's just a stop along the way. And that's my primary concern here is transhumanism and what is this a complete attack and takeover of human reproduction. Mm-hmm. That's my biggest concern here. And they're using they're using trans as the selling point for it. It's just this big propaganda campaign.
So you've done a lot of work organizing your research. Where can people find that? And how can they connect with you and get on board your train of what pill are you selling? It doesn't sound like a black pill exactly. Do you have a color for it yet?
No, I don't. I actually try not to participate in any labeling.
Yeah, I know.
After I used to have so many labels for myself.
Fair enough.
I used to have so many labels for myself and others. I just kind of reject the whole label thing. And I find that I'm able to communicate better with like wider swaths of people when I don't pigeonhole myself into an identity. They're more open to what I have to say, and I can be more open to what they have to say. So I don't have a particular brand of what
Well, you
I'm
still have to
selling, but I
brand.
am.
You have to brand.
Yes. So I do have the deprogrammer is the work that I started out doing. It's like my artistry, I guess. It's like video collages and
Where are you posting these?
infographics. I post them on Instagram. I haven't been posting lately, but I'm going to be posting again.
Yeah.
I kind of got burnt out on it, and also other people sort of started coming to the what should I say, to the table and posting similar things. So I felt like I could take a little bit of a break. But for a couple years, I was just like posting every day on Instagram, posting on Twitter. Of course, I was banned off Twitter for exposing pedophile accounts. That happened years ago. Then I went to Instagram, had a couple platforms there banned. Now I'm on Instagram at the Deprogrammer XX. I'm on YouTube at the Deprogrammer, where I have a number of like little documentaries that I've made. Some of them talking about transhumanism, talking about the Human Rights Campaign, talking about this attack on children that's coming in the form of the normalization of sexualization through trans kids and drag kids. I have a mini documentary about the United Nations there on the Deprogrammer YouTube channel. It's a documentary about the protest that myself and a number of women did back in March. So if you haven't seen it or viewers haven't seen it, go onto my YouTube. You can get a really clear understanding of just what the United Nations role is in female erasure, what they're doing, how they're doing it. You can see some of the propaganda that they use, and you can also witness myself and other women like actually doing something to fight back against that, make it publicly known that we're calling out the UN, that we see them, we know what they're doing. So that kind of stuff can be found on my YouTube. You can go to the deprogrammer.com, which is a website where I've compiled a lot of information around the nonprofits and what I talk about. And also stopfemaleerasure.com is another project of mine that I'm mostly using to collaborate with people and do like direct action activism. So you can look on there to find specifically more information about the United Nations role in female erasure. And it's something, I've just started kind of talking about it, and I have a lot of research, and I'm going to be putting more and more out about this topic. Because I think it's so important that people understand this isn't a fad. Like for years, people were telling me it's a fad, don't worry. Like when I first started speaking out about it, and I was like, I'm really concerned about this. I was like, it's going to go away soon. We just need to ride it out. Pretty soon, all the kids will be over it. And I'm like, well, that might be true. But the reality, like, sure, maybe some people will be over it soon. But the reality is this is an overarching agenda. It is being pushed around the world, and it is changing the social order for the worse. And this is all about, underpinning the creation of a new economy, one that is predicated upon female erasure by erasing females in language and law and simultaneously exploiting the very nature of our bodies for these new technologies that are being created that are ultimately being designed to replace natural, normal human reproduction with a controlled form of reproduction. That's a very brave new world. It's very dangerous. And when you look at the types of technologies that are already in existence, you can tell this isn't science fiction. This isn't somewhere in the future. This is happening right now.
Babies in bags, or baby lambs in bags.
Exactly. The bio bag created at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, CHOP, they did the bio bag. They brought lamb fetuses to term, and they now have a patent out. I need to recheck and see if it's been approved. They were putting out a patent for a bio bag to do the same thing for human babies. So it's not a joke. Babies in bags. This is what they're doing at CHOP. And mind you, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia also does these sex reassignment surgeries on minors. So it's the same people. It's the same industries pushing these technologies. They're all connected. The external wombs, this idea that men can be women. This is all like shifting the power of reproduction away from women and into the hands of the laboratory and into the hands of men, frankly, and male created industries and machines. Not to say that some women aren't involved in this stuff, of course, but ultimately, like, who benefits by usurping female reproductive technology? Not women. Even though there are some, like, feminists have argued in the past, and I think some still do today, or people that call themselves feminists or whatever, have make cases for transhumanism. I think they're severely misguided, but
that's a huge conversation, a huge debate. I'm sure that there's a lot of liberal feminism, strains of liberal feminism that want to harness reproductive power to the nth degree. And some just want to keep it as a personal choice, right? And some want to offshore it to hospitals, right? So I'm sure there's a spectrum. Feminism isn't a monolith, as I've discovered continually over the years.
You're the expert on feminism. You tell me.
I'm not. I never said that. May I call you Kay?
Yes, please.
Fascinating conversation. You have so much energy. You're crisp and clean, and you don't feel like you don't feel down. You're dealing with some pretty dire things, but it doesn't feel like they've stained you or they're sticking to you. You're just really engaged with them in a very crisp and fresh way. And do you do talks like this? Do you do regular podcasts or anything like that?
Actually, this is the first interview I've done where a man has interviewed me since I've been speaking about these topics. So, that was pretty cool. And I'm broadening my network.
Yeah.
So this was actually very nice to be able to speak with someone who's outside my little bubble, because I'm mostly, when I am speaking on this issue, it's to women who are like, please tell me what you think about this.
Yeah.
So it's nice to kind of go outside that little bubble and talk to you and hopefully reach some new people through your audience that have never heard of any of this stuff or maybe haven't looked at it through the lens that I'm using. I really appreciate it, and it's cool. This is awesome to have this conversation. I only regret, I feel like I didn't go enough into all the different things I wanted to talk about, and I was too all over the place.
Don't worry about it. There'll be another day. There'll be another show. We don't have to fit it all in to 2 hours, but I'm going to turn off the recording now. Thank you very much, Kay, for joining me.
Yeah, thank you.
There we go. My
cool.
camera
Thank you very
again.
much.
Wait, what? Stop. Hold on. Stop recording.